This episode is like every man's breakfast. This one's right out of Hannah Glass's 1747 cookbook, and it's for collops and eggs, or as we might know them, bacon and eggs. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So let's cover the ingredients today. They're really simple. I've got some just standard farm fresh eggs here. We've got some salt and pepper, and we've got our collops. Now, in this case, we have sliced bacon. It's a shout out to Connor Prairie. This is aged, smoked bacon that's actually Ossabaw hog bacon, which is a heritage breed that they're working down there at Connor Prairie. So I want to thank them for supplying us with this amazing bacon today. So unfortunately, Connor Prairie does not offer this bacon for sale, or else I'd point you there. You can use extra thick sliced bacon will work for you, but this recipe also says, in the case of collops, that's thinly sliced meat, she says you can use hung beef or hung mutton also. So either one of those are great options too. And in that hung reference means a smoked meat. Well, here's the first step in our recipe. We're gonna fry up this bacon. I am kind of being careful here. I've got the fire banked up here to boil later on. Right now though, to cook up our thick bacon, I've just got coals down underneath our pan. For our eggs, she says to place these in boiling water. I've never cooked these quite like this, so we're gonna see how this turns out. And she says to continue to boil these until the whites of the egg are completely cooked through. And so I suppose the yolks are still gonna be a little soft in there. Obviously, breakfast isn't breakfast without some toast. Toast was really common in the 18th century for meals like this. So we're gonna use one of our toasters and get this bread toasted up. Our bacon's cooked up, our eggs turned out good, at least they look good, and we've got the toast ready, so it's all ready to serve up. Let's give it a try. Excellent, excellent. The eggs, you know, normally runny yolk isn't my thing. This one turned out really good. The bacon has got some amazing flavor and saltiness to it. It might not look that great, but it is really good. And of course, toast. How can you go wrong with eggs and bacon on toast? This is wonderful. This is so simple that any wonderful thick sliced bacon will work in this circumstance. You're gonna love this. It's so simple. It's so wonderful. I really want to encourage you to try this wonderful dish. So simple, so easy. And I want to thank you for coming along, joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. I'm here at Genesee Country Village, a museum. It's a wonderful living history site here in Western New York. This episode today is going to be great. We're making cheese. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. So I'm here today with Deanna Berkemeyer, and she knows cheese. Tell me a little bit about why people are making cheese, especially in a homesteading situation or this kind of situation here in the early 19th century. Why is cheese important?
Well, cheese is a way to preserve your milk. It's how you take care of that 3 gallons of milk approximately that you're getting between April and November.
Okay.
So you can't drink all of that. You have to preserve it somehow. The other purpose for cheese is it stretches out your meat supply as well. So that's an important thing to do to make it last the whole year round.
And it gives you a milk type product to have in the wintertime when your cow isn't giving milk anymore.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. So what kind of cheese are we going to be working on today?
We are making a farmhouse cheese. It's basically an English type cheese.
Okay.
It's a hard cheese.
So it's time to get started. What have we got here?
We have 5 gallons of fresh milk.
What do we do with this?
First, we need to put it on the stove and we need to heat it up to about blood warm.
And how do you tell when you're at the right temperature?
Well, we use our finger, of course.
Okay.
But modern days, it's best always for a new cheesemaker to use a thermometer.
Okay.
So
we're shooting for 85 degrees, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So you're using raw milk here. Most people are not going to have access to raw milk. How can we use pasteurized milk to make cheese?
That's very easy. All you need to do is for every 5 gallons of your pasteurized milk, you're going to add 1 quart of cultured buttermilk. You have to add the good bacteria back in.
So what's happened with pasteurized milk is they've tried to kill off all the bacteria that's going on inside of the milk. And so we have to add some of those back in because we actually need them to make the cheese happen.
Bacteria is a good thing. It creates flavor and it makes the cheese come together.
But there's one more thing. Occasionally people have what they've got in their store is ultra pasteurized milk. Tell me about that.
Ultra pasteurized is not good to use. That's very bad. And the ultra heat treated also, 2 types of pasteurization, is not good. It really will not make a cheese.
So it just won't work?
It just won't work.
Okay.
Don't waste your money on it.
So rennet is a major component of what's happening with cheese. Obviously, it's pretty hard to make cheese without rennet, right?
It's hard to make an aged cheese without rennet.
Okay. What have we got here?
Well, what we have here is one of the ways that they would have had in the 19th century. This is the stomach lining of a calf, an unweaned calf. And so this is where you would get your rennet. You would cut a piece off about the size of a 50-cent piece, tie a string around it, and soak it in some water overnight. It's got the enzymes in it that are needed to coagulate the milk.
But today, what are we using?
Today we're using a commercial rennet. It is actually made in the same way. It's just far, far stronger than they were in the 19th century. Now I'm going to add 1/4 cup of lukewarm water to the little mortar here, and then I'm going to measure in 1.5 teaspoons of our commercial rennet. Now we're going to add it to the milk in the pan that's come up to temperature. So now, John, I'm going to have you stir slowly and gently. I want you to stir up from the bottom and then in a figure 8. You're going to stir for about a minute. After you've stirred the whole minute, then I want you to hold the spoon steady in the middle, and it just stops the milk from moving. So now that we've got it stirred in and blended together, we're just going to let it rest. So we're going to cover it up with a cheese ladder and with a cloth. Flies can bring putrefaction to your cheese.
So calf stomach rennet isn't the only kind of rennet that's available in the 18th and 19th century, right?
No. There is a vegetable rennet that you can use. You can use bed straw, ladies' bed straw, nice flowering plant, and you collect that. And you can soak that also in water, just like we soak the calf stomach, and you pour that in, and that's how your rennet works.
So how long do we need to leave this before we do the next stage?
It's going to stand about 1.5 hours. It's going to take before it's all the way set.
So we've got this close to the fire. Do we need to heat this up, or does it just stay like this?
It needs to stay there and stay warm. You don't want it drafty. You don't want it to cool down too much. Well, John, I'm going to have you lift off the ladder and the cloth, and I'm going to test it for a clean break. So I'm going to stick the end of my finger in. I'm going to lift and see how that curd makes a nice straight line. So we're going to cut the curd. We use a nice long knife, and you just put it in, and we're going to cut it in about 1-inch cubes all the way down to the bottom. When you cut the curds, you're actually creating more surface area that more whey can come out. So at this point, what we want to do is separate the liquid part of the milk from the solid part of the milk. Always making sure you get all the way to the bottom. You can see the whey is already starting to quickly come out in all that surface area that we've created. So now we're just going to cover it back up with our ladder and the cloth to keep the flies out again. And we're going to let it rest another hour or hour and a half. Okay, this is looking real good, John. You can see that the curd has sunk way down. Look how much whey we've got on the top. of the pan and the curd underneath. So now at this point, we're just going to put it back on the stove and begin to heat it.
So you originally broke these up an hour and a half ago when you cut it up, but now you're even continuing to break these longer strips up.
So yes, we are breaking them up. As we stir, we're breaking each of the bigger pieces smaller and smaller as we go, and we'll continue to do that. And as we break it, it throws off even more whey. This is the stage when it's going to really start to throw off a lot of the liquid very fast. We're going to slowly heat it up to 100 degrees. At that point, it will have the proper texture. So unfortunately, you cannot hurry this stage along. If you do heat it too quickly, you will actually form a skin on the curds and it will not release the whey properly. So your cheese will be wet and it will not age properly. Okay, so then all we're gonna do is keep dipping.
So it took you something like almost an hour of just sitting there breaking up these curds slowly this whole time. That is a lot of work.
Now we're gonna pick it up by all four corners.
Okay.
Give it a twist and squeeze out as much as you can.
Oh boy. That's a lot.
So now we're just going to break it up and we're going to put some salt in, about 2 to 3 tablespoons. It's looking pretty good to me.
So you felt the texture of it. You said, okay, we've released enough whey as it is. Now it's time for the, what is this?
This is we're going to put it in the press. So we have a hoop.
Our hoop, okay. And you've pre-buttered.
I did.
Buttered this.
We buttered ours. Not all of them necessarily need to be buttered, but ours doesn't release real well without.
Okay, so it's just a helpful releasing.
So now all we're going to do is we're going to begin
the curds in. Okay.
Crumbling, taking handfuls and crumbling it very evenly into the hoop.
Okay.
So then we just fold these over as smoothly as we can. There's going to be some bunching, but when we take it out and repress it, then that will smooth that all out.
Okay. Now you've got this. Is it called a follower?
This is called the follower.
Okay.
That's correct. And that just fits, and you can see some of the whey starting to come
all the whey
out
is
already.
coming out. Yeah. And this goes straight into our press. It's made specifically for this job.
It is. I'm going to fit this block under.
Okay.
Okay. And then,
I suppose you want to try to keep this nice and even, right?
yep. And you see all that now.
Yeah.
Ideally, we would like that to be a little bit clearer,
Okay.
but
Because we're losing cheese, basically.
we're losing a little bit of the cream, so some of the richness of the cheese. So now we're going to let it sit, and actually after a little while, it will kind of settle, and then we'll come back and retighten.
So right now it's under pressure, but it'll slowly lose that pressure and then we'll tighten it up a little bit more.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep, and then we'll just leave it until tomorrow.
So this cheese is ready to come out. How long has it been in this press?
It's been in the press a couple days. It was taken out and flipped and repressed.
Okay.
And so now it's ready to come out. We're just gonna pry out the follower. Turn it over. And it should fall right down. A little bit of
It is.
There we go. We'll take off the bandage. And pull it off carefully so you don't tear the cheese itself. There we go.
You are going to age this one, but is it okay to eat it right away?
Raw milk cheeses should be kept and aged a minimum of 60 days.
Before they're eaten.
To make sure that the good bacteria have overpowered any bad bacteria that might have gotten in it.
But if you're using a pasteurized milk and buttermilk, it's probably okay if you were going to eat it earlier than that.
It's probably okay to eat as a green cheese.
Okay.
Now I'm going to take the cheese and I'm going to put it in the cabinet with little bit of salt that I've spread around on the shelf, and I'm going to turn the bottom over to the top, and there it is.
Typically these cheeses are aged at least for 60 days, right?
Yes, at least 60 days.
Do you
3
age
months.
them longer than that?
Absolutely you can. The longer you age them, the sharper they get. Sharper and
I
drier.
like cheese. I like sharp cheese. I don't know if I like it too dry, but how does the aging process go with this?
Well, just every day, once you put your cheese on the shelf, every day you're going to turn the cheeses and put them on a dry, salted spot on the shelf.
So we've got a finished cheese here. How long do you think this one's been aged?
Oh, probably at least 2-3 months.
You don't date them?
No, they're not dated.
Okay. Should we find out what they taste like?
Yes.
Okay, let's find out.
All right. Would you like to try a piece?
Yes, I would love to try a piece. So this has definitely got a very, actually this isn't too dry. There's some dampness there.
It'll soften right up in your mouth.
This is a wonderful. It's a little salty than what you might compare to most cheeses today, depending on the cheese. So maybe the level of a Parmesan saltiness, but it's a wonderful sharp flavor to it. Excellent cheese. How would they have typically used a cheese like this?
This kind of a cheese is a grating cheese, so you can make macaroni and cheese.
Okay.
Nice cheese soup. You can. There's all kinds of recipes for using receipts for using cheese.
Many times it would have grated this. It wasn't necessarily a table cheese that you would have eaten as a course by itself or anything like that.
No, probably not. Not when it gets to this harder stage.
Okay. So I want to thank you, Deanna, for showing us this entire process and explaining everything there was to know about this 19th century farmer's cheese. So thank you so much for that. And I really want to encourage anyone, if you're in this Western New York area, make sure to come to this site, this Genesee Country Village and Museum. It's an amazing living history site, so make sure to come and visit it. And I want to thank you for coming along with us today as we discover, as we learn about 19th century cheeses and all these wonderful flavors and the aromas of the 18th and early 19th century. We're here today again at Genesee Country Village and Museum, and they've got a great episode for me today. We're making bread with Barm. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. I'm here today with Peggy Roll. She's the hired cook here in this house, and she's going to show me exactly how to make bread with Barm. So I can't help but notice this is a huge kitchen. Can you tell me a bit about the house and maybe even the kitchen?
All right. Well, this is the house was built in downtown Rochester in 1827 by a miller, Mr. Livingston, and after it was right after the Erie Canal came through in around 1825, and so a lot of wealth was coming into this area, and he could afford to have a big house like this. But then the mills started moving west, and he became bankrupt. And so he sold the house to a Dr. Backus in the 30s. And Dr. Backus lived here. He was the second doctor to come into the Rochester area. And he lived here till the 50s. And he had a hired cook, and that's me. He became a state senator later on, too. So Dr. Backus and his wife, I'm sure, were doing a fair amount of entertaining. And I would have been cooking for them.
Yeah, this is an amazing kitchen, fully equipped and nice and large with this wonderful oven.
Yeah, we have a lovely bread oven that we use, and she probably would have baked once or twice a week and baked the breads and pies and cakes and everything for the family.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about this Barm and getting it ready for baking bread. What have we got here?
Well, I got some Barm from the local brewery, and I was able to make a liquid starter from it. And so what I did is I started out with a little bit of flour, added a little bit of cold water just to mix it up, and added 2 quarts of boiling water. Okay. And then I added some brown sugar, and I let that cool down. I had to cool it down because otherwise I would have killed my yeast. Right. And then I added 4 tablespoons of my fresh Barm and stirred it up, and then I put it in front of the fire overnight, and then the next day we can use that for our bread.
So there's more that we need to know about Barm. I'm going to go over to the brewery and talk to Brian Nagel about where Barm comes from and what it is.
There's been a strong connection between bread and beer for about 8,000 years, ever since they started brewing back in the Fertile Crescent in the Mesopotamians and Syrians. We have known there's a connection with the bakeries and the breweries, so we're very happy to be able to continue that tradition here at the museum by offering up our bakers some of the barm, the yeast that's coming on the surface of the wort here. Well, our yeast is working very nicely. The wort's beginning to ferment here in our fermenting tun. And I do know that our village cooks will be quite excited about coming in to collect some barm from us for baking some breads in the village kitchens. So I'm going to dip in and pull out some of that barm, some of our top fermenting yeast for them to have to do some bread baking. There's a great painting by Louis Miller, a Pennsylvania German artist, from the early part of the 1800s, showcasing a lot of villagers coming to the brewery to get not only beer, but also to pick up some barm for their baking as well. So we're quite excited to be able to do that here at the museum as well for our village cooks.
So now what I'm going to do is I'm adding this to about 8 cups of flour.
Okay.
And I'm just going to make a well into my flour, and I'm going to dump it right in.
Okay, so we have our flour, we have our yeast.
And I'm going to make what's called a sponge.
Okay.
And so I'm going to try to stir in some of this. I'm not going to stir in all the flour right now because we'll need to add a little bit more water to it.
Okay.
But I'm going to stir this in like this. And Miss Leslie's cookbook tells us that we're supposed to then scatter a little flour on top. And then when you can see it bubbling up through the flour, then we're ready to go.
Okay.
So we're checking to make sure that our yeast is active by making this sponge.
So we're going to set this aside. How long are we going to wait?
You know, it might be an hour, maybe.
Okay.
And sometimes a little longer. And then what I'll be doing is adding some more water. This is sort of reverse to the normal way I would have made bread, in that I start out with the flour that I want and add the liquid that I need.
And do we set this by the fire or just someplace warm-ish?
In a warm place. I'm going to cover it up.
Okay.
And then I'll be able to set it in a warm place. I usually put it on a trivet over near the fire, but not right next to it.
Wonderful.
So here I have a nice
You can tell
sort of
it's
mass
active
here.
and it's ready to go.
I do have to add a little bit of salt.
Okay.
So I'm going to put about 2 teaspoons of salt in here. I'm going to put some flour on my board here.
Okay.
And a little flour on top so I can dig it out of here. So then we can just start kneading it. It's real nice dough.
It's so very white too.
It is. Well, this is a wealthy household, so we probably would have gotten the finest flour we could have gotten.
I'm here today with Pat Mead. She's the head of foodways here at Genesee Country Village and Museum, and we're talking about this recipe. The recipe that we're making this bread from is
from Miss Leslie's cookbook, and Miss Leslie is an author from Philadelphia, but she cites in her book, when you make bread, you need to use the finest ingredients, and especially your flour. And she also says you should purchase it from Hiram Smith from Rochester, New York. Now, where we are here in the village or so is wheatland, and this is where they would be growing the wheat. It is also mentioned in books that Queen Victoria ordered her flour from here because it was known as the finest, some of the finest flour around.
That's happening right here in Rochester.
That's right.
So it was a wheat growing area, specifically a good wheat growing area, and it did have lots of mills in the area too?
It did. Later on they moved out west, but there were quite a few here. And also what was very interesting is that down in Mumford, not too far from here, is the Presbyterian Church, and you can find Hiram Smith's window there, stained glass window in memory of him.
So he probably paid for, his family paid for a special window in the church right here in Mumford.
Right.
Wow. So I want to thank Pat for giving us this a little bit of extra knowledge about wheat and flour that came from right here in the Rochester, New York area. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I would need this probably for 8 or 10 minutes until
So-
it's nice and stretchy and you have a nice ball. But this is actually pretty good. And you're just making it nice and firm. You're developing the gluten. But you notice that I, I didn't add any butter or oil or
Right.
sugar to this. This is a very simple receipt, and it just has flour and salt and this Barm starter.
Right.
And that's it.
And water, yeah.
It gave wonderful flavor. So this was a double batch of bread, and so I'm going to cut the loaf here in half and make 2 rounds out of it. And I'm going to put it in my buttered dish here, just like that, and I will cover it up, and I'll put it in my warm place for an hour or so.
Okay.
And I'll wait for my bake oven to be ready, and then
So you're
we'll
just
put it in
going to
the
let
oven.
this rise about an hour?
Right, about an hour. That's
Okay.
right.
Until it maybe doubles in sizes?
Yeah,
Size?
it's about doubled inside.
Okay.
That's right.
So here, this one is ready. This one's risen an hour.
Right?
Is it
An
ready
hour
to
or
go
so?
in the oven just like this?
I think it's ready to go. I think let's see, you can feel it sort of soft around the side.
Right, okay, so this one's ready to go in the oven. What about this oven?
This is our bake oven over here that we use. To use my bake oven, I heat it up for 3 hours with a very good fire, and that's going to bring it up to a quick oven, about what we would call 425 degrees. So I'm going to use my peel, and I'm going to take all the coals out of there, and then I'm going to sweep it out with a wet broom. And this, by sweeping out with a wet broom, not only am I getting the rest of the coals out, but I'm also adding a little steam to the oven.
So I just saw you stick your arm in there. What were you doing?
Well, I'm feeling the temperature of the air that's in the oven. I'm not going to touch anything.
Okay.
I'm not going to get burnt. I'm just going to stick my arm in there. If I get up to 7, it's about 425 degrees.
So this loaf is just out of the oven.
Right.
It's baked about 20 minutes.
25 minutes. I checked it and put it in for another minute or two.
And out it comes in the oven. What are we doing now?
Well, we wrapped it up in a damp cloth, and they liked soft crust. apparently.
Okay.
And so we have it a damp cloth, and we'll let it cool here, and then I will put it in a dry cloth, and we'll put it in our bread box.
So we're not just gonna cut it open right away and start trying to eat it?
They didn't like that way. No, we do, but they didn't like it that way.
Well,
They didn't even think it was healthy. They thought, you really should let it sit for a day or so before you tried to eat it. Here's our loaf of bread, and we couldn't cut this and try and see what it
right,
looks
let's go ahead and try out your bread. You don't, obviously, we never know what we're gonna find
We don't
inside
know
our loaf
what-
of bread.
we don't
Well,
know.
hopefully we're gonna find bread. It smells like a wonderful bread.
They smell
And
good.
it's got it's got a crumb and texture that's great shape. And
Pretty good.
Yeah, it's got some nice rich flavor. It must have really developed some of that sponge there and sitting and waiting. It's developed some wonderful flavors. Obviously, it's baked the perfect amount. This looks really good, and it's a great and very easy
It's very easy.
bread to make. Peggy, I so want to thank you for showing me this whole process and how to use this Barm. Thank you so much for showing everyone here about this process. It's been very, very interesting. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
And I really do encourage anyone who is in the area, if you're in this Western New York area or even anywhere close, you should really come and visit the Genesee Country Village and Museum. It's an amazing place with all these wonderful buildings and great interpreters, and truly a great living history site. So make sure to come here if you're in the area at all. And I want to thank everyone. As you watch these videos, you experience these experiments in historical cooking and all these wonderful flavors that we get out of this. Thank you so much for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th and early 19th century.
Hello, my name is Brian Nagel, Director of Interpretation here at Genesee Country Village and Museum. I wanted to welcome you to the Walter Greaves Brewery here at the museum. The brewery was built actually by our founder, John Whaley, who was president of Genesee Brewing Company at the time the museum got started in 1966. He wanted to make sure the village was complete, so along with the houses, the businesses, the shops, the churches and taverns, we also had a working brewery here at the village. So we're very happy to be celebrating the tradition here at the museum now, brewing the way it was done back in 1803. We're very lucky that Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk, sailed from Scotland to North America. One of the things he did when he was here was actually visited a number of businesses, business owners, all across New York State. Luckily for us, he stopped in Geneva, New York, and talked to Walter Greaves, who owned a brewery just like this one, a malt house to make malted barley, and a distillery right on the shore of Seneca Lake. We know that Mr. Greaves was using a pump log just like this one to pump water up from the lake into the brew kettle. Today we're using a German-style brew kettle to heat up our water for doing the mashing, along with boiling our wort as part of the process as well. The main difference between a German-style brew kettle and an English kettle is the English kettles have a spigot on the side to make moving liquid around much easier than we have today. For me now, my process of moving water or wort around is using a dipper just like this one to move about 160 gallons of water from the kettle right behind me down the trough into our mash tun. Each time we do the mashing here in the brewery, we're using 250 pounds of grain of malted barley and wheat, along with 160 gallons of hot water to do the mashing process. We use 4 kinds of grain here. We use a pale malted barley, brown and amber roasted barley, and wheat as well. Before we can actually use the grain, however, we have to mill the grain. We have to break open the hull on the outside to actually expose the starch and the sugar on the inside of the grain to be able to convert the starches and sugars into more sugar to make our wort doing the mashing process. Now that our grain has all been milled, Matt is just finishing up putting the grain into the mash tun. Now the mash tun is ready to accept the hot water along with the grain. The mash tun has a false bottom in the bottom of it. That means there's 3 pie-shaped pieces of wood with holes drilled in it. This serves as a platform for the grain, but also as a sieve or a colander to allow the liquid to flow through our wort or sugar water and keep the grain behind. I'm back at the brew kettle, back to check the temperature of our water. Matt's built a great fire for us. You can see the steam rising right now. I'm going to reach in. Yeah, that feels just about right. I'll now start to ladle the hot water down the trough behind me into the mash tun and begin the mashing process. All of our milled grain is now in the mash tun. The water is going to flow down this trough and into our side pipe. Our side pipe has 2 doors in it. One door is actually in the bottom below the false bottom, which will allow the hot water to percolate up through the grain, providing a very even and efficient mash during the process. Once my grain is floating in that hot water, I'm going to open up this door and allow the water to come in right through this door into the grain and finish off the mashing process. Now that we've combined the hot water and the grain, we'll begin the mashing process. Matt will stir the grain and the water together for about half an hour, and then we'll let it steep together for about an hour and a half, allowing the hot water to steep up through the grain in the beginning. Gives us a nice, even, very efficient mash. Now we're letting it rest for a bit. For 2 hours, we'll get together and we'll begin to allow the wort to flow through the false bottom and down to our underback. We've waited our 2 hours for the mash to conclude. Everything looks good upstairs. We're now going to open the valve in the bottom of the mash tun, allowing our wort to flow through the false bottom and into the underback to start collecting the wort to get ready to pump it upstairs to start the final boil. This is the second pump log we have here in the brewery. The first one brought water up from the basement, from the lake. This one brings up the wort that we just sent down from the mash tun down to the underback. It's been collected there, about 160 gallons of wort collected down below. This pump goes right down into the bottom of that underback, and now we just pump that liquid back up here into our brew kettle. Matt's got the fire going once again. We're going to add some more sugar to this, more fermentable sugar, molasses or brown sugar or maple sugar in our neck of the woods. And then 2 pounds of hops will go in as well. We want to balance off the flavor of the maltiness, the sweetness of the brew, along with the hops we have here as well. Well, we finished boiling our wort. We boiled it for about 2 hours. We added in our 12 pounds of sugar. We've put in the 2-pound bag of hops for the last half hour of the boil. Now we've actually begun to transfer the liquid, the wort, from the brew kettle over into our chillers. The very important part of the process is installing a hop jack on the far end of the trough. Hop jack is a bag full of straw in a box with dowels in the bottom. That hop jack will capture any of the hops, big bits of grains that have made it through the process so far. Hopefully keep our wort as clean as possible when it goes into the chillers. Right now I'm standing next to our chillers, or our cooling trays, that allows us to cool down our wort from 212 degrees down to blood temperature, or about 100 degrees Fahrenheit by the touch going through here. Critical part of the brewing process to make sure we can get that cooled down to that temperature within 2 hours of coming off of the boil. If it takes longer than that, it's going to sour our batch or spoil our batch and not be fit to actually go on to fermentation and to create the beers and ales. So for that purpose, we're back in 1803, only brewing in, again, March, April, and May, and October to December, when it's cool enough outside for this wort to cool down in a couple of hours. We're still waiting for our wort to cool down a little bit more, but once it's down to blood temperature, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, we're going to open up the last of the plugs on our chillers and bring that wort down through this hose into one of our fermenters. We are open fermenting the ale right now. We're going to pitch our yeast, add our yeast into the mixture, and that yeast is going to go into the wort. It's going to start to feed on the sugar in the wort, converting that sugar into alcohol, but also making carbon dioxide gas as a byproduct. We call it open fermentation, even though we have some small caps that go on top of those. It'll stay in there fermenting, creating that carbon dioxide gas and alcohol for 3 or 4 days in an active process. After that starts slowing down, we'll open up the valve in the front of the fermenting tun and send that now partially fermented beer through small funnels in the floor down to the basement to do secondary or final fermentation. We're now in the basement of the building. You'll notice the stone walls behind me. Also coming down from the first floor, a leather hose. This is going to bring the primary fermentation from the fermentation casks upstairs, the tuns upstairs, down to our casks down here. This is where the final fermentation takes place. We're going to bring down that beer from upstairs. We're going to bring it into our casks. We're going to add some more yeast and some more sugar to keep that fermentation going. Mr. Greaves Brewery is making the high quality or the strong beers and ales, and so we want to keep that going here as well. We're going to actually put a cap on the top of this. We want to capture the carbon dioxide gas coming off of the fermentation process to create the carbonation in the beers in 1803. We'll come down every once in a while. We'll open up the cask. We will pour off some of the beer inside, check for its alcohol content with a hydrometer, but also its carbonation as well. In November and December, we can let this actually ferment in here a bit longer. It's colder outside, it's cooler down in the basement. It'll stay safe longer as well. We can make our stronger beers and ales in those months, getting it close to even 13% alcohol at that point in time. When it's ready to go, when it's the right alcohol content and the right carbonation, we'll pour off the beer and the ales into 32.5 gallon casks that are then sold to the stores, the taverns, the inns in and around Geneva, New York. And then it's sold out to customers there by the growler, by the pail, by the bottle as well. Thank you very much for joining us today at the Walter Greaves Brewery at Genesee Country Village Museum. We're so proud to be able to showcase the way brewing was done in the late 1700s and early 1800s here in Western New York. So please come out and see us when you have a chance between May and October and ask us any questions you'd like to. We'd be more than happy to share our story and the story of early brewing in North America.
I really want to give a special thank you to Brian Nagel for explaining this brewing process to us. He did such an amazing job. And if you're ever in this Western New York area, please come and visit the Genesee Country Village Museum. It's an amazing place. And I want to thank you for coming along and joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Hi, I'm here today with Marie Schultz, and she's going to show us how to make sausage. Where does this recipe or receipt come from?
This receipt comes from Hannah Glass.
Uh-huh.
It's from her cookbook, Plain and Fancy.
Okay.
1808, I think.
Right.
It's the right time period for it.
Okay.
It's a very simple, very basic receipt. Anybody can kind of do this one, and then you can, if you need to, add on to it.
Right.
My grandmother, I think it's my great-grandmother's receipt for it, sausage, and she adds it a little bit more seasonings to it.
Right,
She
so
does
the
a
original
little
one is
herbs.
plain, waiting for a
Very
little
plain,
embellishment.
Exactly. This is the type that if you are in a log home like this, that you should be able to have everything.
Okay, so, well, let's get started. What do we need?
All right, well, the first thing we're going to need to make sausage is we have to have the casings.
Okay.
Now, we know these are hog casings. They were cleaned very, very well and then probably stored in salt.
Uh-huh.
And because of that, we want to soak them.
Right.
And they'll get nice. So I have sage. She says very finely chopped.
Okay.
So I chopped as fine as I could.
Right.
Then we have, again, she says chopped pepper
Okay.
instead of ground pepper. So I took her for her word, and I actually most of the time just chop it up. And this way you're going to bite into some peppercorns, and that's going
It's
to
got
give you
some-
some
it's
taste.
got some bite to it, yeah.
Exactly. And then, of course, you can't have sausage without salt.
Right.
So we have salt ready for it. Now, the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to chop up our meat. I'm using pork. You could use beef,
Uh-huh.
but pork is just a, well, when I think of
traditional,
beef, I
yeah.
think of sausage, I think of pork.
Okay. So we're looking specifically for very lean cuts, or?
We want some fat in it. In fact, if it's not enough fat, you might want to put some suet into it.
Uh-huh.
All right? And this one here, we did add a little bit of suet.
Okay.
And we are going to take everything we've done, and I've got about around 3 pounds. This is what Hannah's receipt is calling for. It's about 3 pounds.
Okay.
So we'll put that all in there. So we want about 2 teaspoons of salt.
Okay.
We want about a teaspoon of pepper
In our 3 pounds, right?
in our 3 pounds, yep. And then about 3 teaspoons,
And this is sage.
and this is sage.
Okay. And was this fresh sage, or it was dried?
This is fresh.
Okay, fresh. Yeah, I can smell it. So
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, this was fresh chopped this morning.
Okay,
We
very
just
good.
chopped it up as fine as we could. All right, now the thing is going to be to mix it. Am
Okay.
I going to do all the work? Are you going to help me?
I don't know. I don't have an apron or anything.
All right, I guess I have to do all the work. All right. Now we got it mixed up pretty good here.
So what do we got here?
Now, this is a wonderful sausage stuffing.
Okay.
This is my favorite. Put the hog casing on.
So you
nose.
call it a casing. What do we really have here?
You've got intestines.
Okay. So
Yeah.
they're cleaned.
These have been cleaned. They've been washed through water and salt water, and then they've been stored in salt.
Okay.
And then I just soak them. You can soak them overnight. You can just soak them for a few hours. All you want to do is rinse them real good, get a lot of the salt out of them as much as possible, and then keep them a little soft so that you can work with them.
But they're just natural.
They're
right?
just natural.
After butchering, this is what you get.
This is what you get.
Okay.
Yep.
So what are you trying to do with this end?
All I'm trying to do is just open it up now
Okay.
so that we can open up the casings. You're going to hold this like this for me.
Okay.
All right. And now you are going to put it up to your lips and you are going to blow through.
Okay. So we're trying to inflate
We
this
are
thing.
inflating this. Oh, you are good.
And what you're doing is pulling all that
I'm just
casing
pulling
onto the
all
horn.
right on here. Now you can either be the catcher or the presser.
I'll press.
Oh, good. I was hoping you would say that.
Wait, maybe I got the hard. Maybe I got the hard part now. So.
You got to hold it up to your tummy.
Okay. Okay. Like that.
Yep, you got to get pressure.
Okay.
Now I'm going to hold it back, and I'm going to say, okay.
Okay.
Yep,
So we're making the individual links
we're
at this
making
point.
individual links.
Okay, and I keep going.
Keep going. All right, now I'm going to go counterclockwise.
Ah,
Now this is going to be, keep it so they don't unwind on us.
all right. I think I'm almost out.
Okay. I'll roll that one up.
Okay.
All right, so now we have all of our sausage stuffed, and we're ready. Now Hannah says to fry it.
Okay. So
She
this
also
isn't
says-
aged. This isn't an aged
No.
sausage. This is
You
use
could
it
hang
ready-
it and you could smoke it.
Okay.
There'd be no reason why you couldn't probably smoke it. But this is a little bit more like a summer sausage, or not a summer sausage, I'm sorry. A breakfast sausage.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's a little bit more like that. She also says if you can't stuff it, you don't have any casings,
Uh huh.
then just roll them up.
Okay.
So we just fry these up there. That's all it takes?
Well, that's what Hannah says.
Okay.
Hannah says to just fry them.
Okay.
But I have read other receipts, and again, I'm going back to my grandmother. She always did them, I guess we want to call them, well, back then she would have said she's boiling them up a little bit.
Oh.
I'm just going to take a little water. We could use beer. We could use cider, anything like that. Put them into that, put a lid on them, and let them cook, let the water cook down.
So kind of basically pre-cook them in a liquid.
You're pre-cooking them, because, you know, you're always worried about pork, especially back then. And this way you were always sure that it was cooked through.
Right, so you had it. And then after that, you come and fry them.
Exactly.
So these have already been fried up. They look wonderful. They smell wonderful.
Good.
I suppose we should try them out.
I think we should.
Okay.
You take that one, I'll
Okay.
take this one.
That is amazing, wonderful
That's very good.
breakfast sausage, just like I would expect.
Needs a little rosemary though.
This held together very nicely because of the casing. It doesn't fall apart on you.
Exactly.
So these are excellent, wonderful. So thank you so much for all this amazing information. And really, I want to encourage anybody, if you're in this area or you're traveling through this area, to make sure to come and visit Genesee Country Village and Museum. It's an excellent living history site and so much fun. So many amazing buildings and people who work here. So if you get a chance, make sure to come by. And I want to thank you for coming along as we explore these amazing flavors and techniques, all from the 18th and early 19th century. Occasionally, while doing our research, we run across a food that can be very confusing, perhaps even controversial, at least to some of you viewers. We're going to try to shed a little light on one of these foods. The title for this episode is The Crumpet Controversy. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. Today I've got Kevin joining me for this controversial crumpet topic. Now, usually whenever we start working on a recipe or a kind of food, we really like to dig into the roots of it as best we can. And many times we find these roots of modern foods right there in the 18th century and before.
Recently in our research, we ran across a recipe in Elizabeth Raffald's 1769 cookbook, The Experienced English Housekeeper. And the recipe that caught our attention was called To Make Tea Crumpets.
Now, while many of the English influenced cultures and societies in the 18th century and even now have this term crumpet, it is basically unheard of here in the Midwest in the 21st century. We don't have anything that we call a crumpet.
About the only time I hear about it is when I'm watching a movie or something. They'll say tea and crumpets.
Right, but we don't have anything like that.
Now, a modern style crumpet is soft bread that's cooked on a griddle in a ring form, so they're uniform shape. And probably the most distinguishing feature are the holes in top, perfect for soaking up melted butter and jam. And they're usually toasted before being served.
Right, probably the closest thing that we have today is something we would call an English muffin, and we would slice it open and have those same kind of holes in it.
Right, in fact, an English muffin is cooked the same way, well, not necessarily in a form, but cooked on a griddle.
So these look really good. Let's get started and make some 18th century style crumpets.
Perfect. All right, we're having this recipe. I'm starting with 1 cup of whole milk.
Okay.
It can be 2%, whatever your choice is, and the same amount of hot water. Now, this is really hot water. That's cold milk. What I want in the end is a warm water milk mixture. Right. And to that, 1 egg. And if you can whisk that up.
I'll whisk that up.
And then the recipe says to add to this 1 large spoon of Barm. Now,
Barm.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about Barm. We're going to put a link in the description below to tell you what Barm is. Barm is the yeast that's taken from a brewing batch of beer. A baker would get it from the brewer. We, today, for sake of convenience, are going to use about a teaspoon of instant yeast. Will make no difference. If you're doing this at a reenactment or at a historic site, you can make your own Barm. We show how to do that. Now here, I have 2 cups of flour.
Okay.
So we'll pour this in. You can go ahead and mix that up.
Okay.
Okay, and that is it.
Okay.
And what we need to do
There you go.
is we're gonna cover this up, set it aside, and let it bubble and rise for about an hour.
Okay.
Now, the earliest versions of crumpets seem to be associated with buckwheat.
Buckwheat's actually where we started with this little adventure. Someone on the YouTube channel was asking about buckwheat, and it led me straight to crumpets, because crumpets are one of the ways that buckwheat was used most often in the 18th century, and you'll find references to that. Now, buckwheat is really, really interesting because buckwheat is not wheat. It's not even, in fact, a grain at all. It's actually the ground seeds of a plant that's a lot like rhubarb. And it shows up in the 18th century and even later on with different kinds of cultures as sort of a lower class grain or a lower class flour used in less expensive things.
And even used to feed livestock as well.
Right.
And buckwheat was common not only in Great Britain, but also in North America during the 18th century.
Right, you'll find Peter Kalm's America, his travels through America, he references buckwheat. And you'll find many other references to North American use for buckwheat.
Now, in Rafald's cookbook, these are called tea crumpets.
Right.
So these would have been made with more refined flour, a wheat flour.
Right, and that's what she uses in the recipe, right?
Right.
She's not actually calling for buckwheat.
Right. In fact, according to the Oxford Companion on Food and Drink, they say that Rafald's recipe from 1769 is probably the earliest published recipe for what we would consider the modern crumpet.
Right, you'll find references to crumpets earlier. We just don't have any recipes for those crumpets. And many times those references they were actually probably speaking about the buckwheat version of crumpet. But this is a high class version.
Yes.
The batter looks wonderful, very active and ready to go.
It's perfect, yeah.
Okay.
And we're using our double brazier today.
Okay.
You know, a couple of words of caution. You don't want to use this inside.
Right.
Last time we used it, we didn't use the heat shield and we burned our table. So
Right.
today we have our heat shield. And we've got kind of a medium heat going on here. Elizabeth Rafald offers this neat little hint. You take a wad of butter and wrap it up in a cloth, and you use that to grease up your pan, and it leaves just enough.
Right.
I'm going to use that next time I make pancakes.
Right, it looks great. Let me put a little bit of the batter in there, and
A couple of scoops.
yeah, there we go. And there you are.
You know, John, we just said don't do this inside, but our kitchen here is well ventilated, so we're safe. John, we're going to want to take our time with these. If you cook them too fast, they're going to burn on the bottom. And we're going to cook these until these bubbles start to pop and stay open. And the surface then will look dry. So this looks perfect. See how it's dried out on top? Okay. So we're going to flip this, and it doesn't have to cook for very long. Only about 30 seconds on the other side. You know, John, this is where the controversy comes in, because some of our viewers are going to be adamant that what we're making here is not a crumpet, but rather a pikelet.
Again, a word I've never heard.
Okay, well, a pikelet is, in essence, just like a crumpet, except that it's not made without a form. It's free form and consequently thinner.
Right.
And that's exactly what we have here in this 18th century crumpet.
Right, and even the word crumpet, I mean, even though it's got all these kind of roots in other words for the same kind of food product, that the word crumpet actually means that the root form of it has to do with this curling up, this crumpling of the edges, something that would happen with a much thinner kind of food product, like a thin pancake.
It's another form of griddle bread. And in fact, there's what they call a Scottish pancake that is also considered a crumpet, a fruit crumpet,
Okay.
that are actually curled up to hold the fruit.
Right. Yeah, so here we have these. In fact, if you look at this buckwheat, it looks just like a pancake. And even today, we know in North America that we make buckwheat pancakes all the time. It's basically the same thing. It's a crumpet, isn't it?
Right, exactly. The terms seem to be interchangeable in the 18th century. In fact, Elizabeth David, she wrote this book in 1977 called English Breads and Yeast Cookery. And she dedicates about 20 pages to this topic, the interchanging of the names and the confusion that even happened in the 18th century. We now have these. Let's go on ahead and toast them up and try them.
And normally in the 18th century, they would have had these pre-cooked like this, and then they would have heated them up.
Right.
Okay.
Right. They would not have served them hot off the griddle.
Right.
Would have let them cool. They would have made them ahead of time, and then toasted them right before they served them.
Well, they look great. They're nice and warm after you toasted them on the brazier. We could have used our toaster, but I guess let's give it a try. Well, it's kind of plain. Maybe it needs more topping, huh?
I think I've got some jam here.
Okay. It has a nice English muffiny texture, except it's a little softer.
Very soft on the inside, kind of crispy on the outside. Well, butter and jam on that. That's fantastic. It's the first time I've had a crumpet.
Wonderful. Yeah, me too. Amazing, wonderful, easy to do. Takes a little bit of time. It's certainly something completely kind of different, but now we know exactly what a crumpet, especially an 18th century crumpet, is going to be like. I know there's some of you out there, that's a pikelet, or that's
not a crumpet.
Yeah. This is a crumpet right out of Rafald's 1769 cookbook. Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin, for bringing this one in, and I want to thank everyone out there as we continue to kind of experiment and we try these things out, and you never really know quite what you're getting into until you finish up. So thank you so much for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. I'm Jon Townsend, and today we'll be preparing potted meats in the 18th century style. In the past, we've done a whole series on food preservation techniques in the 18th century. And we touched on at the time the idea of potting or potting meats, but we didn't get a chance to do it. Today, we are going to pot this beef. Potted meat recipes can be very complex. They can take a while to do, but I wanted to find something very simple. It took a while, but there's a very simple potted beef recipe in Charlotte Mason's A Lady's Assistant from 1777. And this one's called To Pot Cold Beef, and it's actually, the recipe starts after you have a cut of beef that's already been cooked and you want to pot it. Maybe like you've eaten half of it, but you want to preserve the next half over the next several weeks. And so to get started with this one, I've actually taken a chuck roast, and you need to cook that well so that it falls apart. The best way to do that really is either to cook it in a Dutch oven for 2 or 3 or even 4 hours at a nice low temperature, or if you want to cheat in a modern oven or a modern kitchen, you could use your slow cooker and just put it on low and let your chuck roast cook overnight. Just put a couple of cups of water, or if you want to add a little bit of flavor in it, you could use a cider or something like that in there to give it some liquid. Make sure to cover that up. In the time period, these recipes, they would actually say to use a ceramic vessel to bake your meat in and then cover it over with paper. So you want to trap that moisture, and that's the idea here. We want a very, very moist and fall apart kind of meat. So here's our finished meat, and you can see how amazingly tender it is. I wanted something that was just fall apart, and that's what we're looking for here. What we need to do with this meat is actually tease it apart, tear it apart, and remove all the fat and any kind of sinews in it. We want just plain straight meat, that's all. First, we put our meat into the bowl, And now we're gonna put in some more spices. Let's add another bit of salt and some pepper, and she also calls for some nutmeg or some mace in there as well to help season this. And then let's add some butter. I don't know. She doesn't call for an exact amount, so let's say a third as much in weight as the amount of meat that you have here. Now that we've got all our ingredients, we need to pulverize this, pound this into a mix that's just very, very smooth, like a pate. That's what we're looking for here. So our meat is nice and pulverized. It's very fine. She even says sometimes referring to it changing color. It's not like turn yellow, which means you can tell it's very finely pulverized. That's what we're looking for. Now it's time to put it into the pots. And she actually, in some of the recipes, mentions using a smaller pot like this. So you want to have a pot that's not too big, because once you break the seal on this, it's going to start to go bad. So you don't want to have a large pot. You want to have a 1 or 2 serving kind of pot. That way you can use it all at once. We just need to take our mixture here and pack it tightly into the bottom of the pots. We're trying to get rid of any air pockets. And we're going to fill it up to within, say, about an inch, or if your pot's really shallow, say a ½ inch to the top. But we want to leave some spot at the top for our clarified butter when we get done packing these pots. It's hard to find a good, safe recipe and one that's easy to do for potted meat. The trick is at this stage that we can't just pour clarified butter on these because they would go bad. But some of the recipes actually call for taking these pots before they get the clarified butter, putting them in the oven and warming them back up to temperature, say 200, 250 degrees for 10 or 15 minutes. We want to make sure that all the meat is basically pasteurized in these pots. So that's what we're gonna do with these. We're gonna set these aside, and I'm gonna take them and I'm gonna put them in the oven for at about 200, 250 degrees for 10 or 15 minutes, however long it takes to get it so that they're heated all the way through. Then we can bring them back. Once your little pots are heated fully up to temperature, you can bring them out of the oven, and while they're still warm, you want to pour clarified butter on top. You want at least 1/4 of an inch, probably a ½ inch, or maybe a whole inch of clarified butter up on top of these little pots. Here they are, and they finally cooled off. I did have issues with the clarified butter. It shrinks just like wax does. When you're making wax candles, if you've ever done that, the wax will kind of shrink and it'll give you a cavity in the center. So you'll need to kind of keep filling this up depending on how much clarified butter you put in there. That's why you want to put a nice thick layer, so even if it shrinks, it doesn't shrink away from the meat completely. To make them last a little bit longer, they should have another covering to put on top to protect even the clarified butter. So you can put a little cloth on there and tie that off. That's why these have a little ring around them, so you can tie them off and the fabric stays on. You could use something like a hog's bladder, and we have the imitation hog's bladder on the website. That's another even better seal for these to keep these longer. In the 18th century, they would have stored these down in their cellar where it was nice and cool. And even then, they did not expect these to last very long. Generally, the recipes say that they'll be good for a month or 6 weeks, maybe 2 months at the max. So, in our modern context, you'll want to store these in the refrigerator until you're ready to use them. And they should be good. And isn't this interesting? It's very similar to, say, what would happen. It's sort of like canning, right? You get all these things up to temperature and then you try to seal the air away from them. It's exactly what we're doing with this. So I've got some toast here to try this out. So let's crack open one of these and find out exactly how it tastes. And you know, there aren't a lot of directions. It doesn't say how they would actually end up using this potted meat. But I'm gonna guess that they would have it on toasts or crackers or something like that. Let's find out. Wonderful flavor. Tastes great, especially on something like the toasts. All those little spices come out. I might add more nutmeg to it, but it's got a wonderful texture and a wonderful taste. And it is one of the ways that they preserved meat over time. Instead of having a salted beef, they many times would have a product like this. And it was really nice because you can take these with you. If you're going someplace and you want to take some food with you, it has its pot with it. And it's ready to eat whenever you are. You don't even need toasts or crackers or anything like that. You can just scoop right in there and eat it if you're hungry. A really interesting way of preserving things, almost like canning today. Very, very great. This one was really interesting. It was fun to research. I hope you give it a chance, especially if you're a reenactor. This would be wonderful to put into your living history persona. You could take one of these to an event. That would be great. And if you're just somebody out there who's interested in history, it's a great little experiment to try at home. I want to thank you for coming along as we experiment, as we try these things, as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm Jon Townsend, and today we're going to be exploring a boiled pudding. This one's called a batter pudding, and we'll be experimenting with some variations on a wonderful pudding sauce. This recipe is from Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery, Plain and Easy, probably the most popular English cookbook from the 18th century. And this one's called a batter pudding. It's an interesting pudding. Most of the boiled puddings we've done have been puddings that had suet in them. This one does not have suet in it. And there's even a variation on this where you can make it without eggs. So it's probably a fairly, let's say, an inexpensive pudding. Before we get started, let's go over the ingredients so you can try this at home. We're gonna start off with flour. Now this is one of the tricky parts in the recipe because it calls for 6 spoonfuls of flour. Well, what spoonful? You know, is a teaspoon, a tablespoon? So she's talking about a kitchen spoonful, which is the equivalent to 6 tablespoons. So in this recipe where we're cutting it in half, we need 3 spoonfuls. That turns out to be a cup and a little bit more of regular all-purpose flour. We need 1 pint of milk. We have here 2 whole eggs and 1 egg yolk. Salt, we need about, let's say, half a teaspoon of salt. We also need a half a teaspoon of ginger, and then we can add some currants. That's a typical addition to these kind of recipes. So I've got some Zante currants here that we can add in. So this one's fairly easy. Let's get these things all mixed together. I'm gonna start off with my, my eggs, and let's get them whisked up fairly smooth. One of the things about this pudding is that it should end up having a very, very smooth texture. Now let's add our milk to this. We've got our pint of milk. I'm gonna go ahead and add in our salt. We need a half a teaspoon of salt and the same for our ginger. Now we're gonna get these, all this ginger nice and mixed in. Now comes the challenge of the flour. If we just plop this all in really quick, it can be difficult. It's gonna lump up. In fact, you kind of hear in some of the directions for different batter puddings, the difficulty of getting everything in there nice and smooth. I'm gonna add a little bit at a time. Hopefully you've got it nice and smooth. There are some directions where if it's not smooth enough, if you've got lumps in it, you can put it through a sieve and press the extra through to get it a little bit smoother. This one, it's a little lumpy, but I think it's gonna be just fine. Last of all, I'm gonna add in some Zante currants, about a handful. There's no set amount that needs to be put in here, and you can leave them out altogether. It depends on how rich your pudding is. So if you've got a lot of currants in here or raisins, you've made a rich pudding. And if you don't have any, well, it's a bit more of a meager pudding. Now I've got our pudding cloth that we're going to boil this in. You need to have a nice tightly woven cloth. On our website, we do sell our natural linen kitchen towel, which is perfect for this. You can use a good kitchen towel. It's got a nice fine texture. We also have an Osnaburg towel. You don't want to use something like cheesecloth though, that has too open a weave. You want to use a nice tight weave and a natural fiber. I've got my cloth. I've already put the cloth into boiling water. I made sure that it's a nice clean cloth, and we put it in boiling water. We put it in our bowl here, and now I'm going to sprinkle flour all over on the inside of our pudding bag. If we don't, the pudding will be difficult to remove. Now we can pour in our batter. And you can see why she calls this a batter pudding, because really it's about the thickness of something like pancake batter. Let's go ahead and tie this up now. Now we can tie this off. We want it to be fairly tight, but there we go. So we've got it fairly tight. We're gonna tie it off with a good stout string. Now this is ready to go in our pot of boiling water. You wanna make sure the water is hot, boiling completely when you put it in, because it's gonna cool it off. And it should stay in boiling water the entire, let's say 45 minutes, possibly an hour. It's kind of hard to overcook a boiled pudding. That's the nice part about it. They're cooked at a fairly low temperature. The trick with this one, especially if you have the currants in there, is that the currants will all want to fall to the bottom of your pudding. They'll all be in one spot unless you keep rotating it, especially at the very beginning of its boil. So put it in the boiling water. After a minute or two, try to flip it over upside down and get those currants spread around. Keep it moving for the first 5 or 10 minutes. After that, you're probably safe in just letting your pudding sit there and boil the whole time, occasionally rotating it. This has been boiling probably for about an hour. Plenty of time. The original one was an hour and 15 minutes, and that was twice as big, so we definitely don't need to boil as long. Now, to get these out without them pulling it apart, you'd have to be very careful. This is a much more, let's say, fragile pudding. You can dunk these in cold water to help separate the bag from it. We're gonna gently pull the top part away. That's the hardest part because of all the folds. And there we go. That one turned out pretty well. Now we have to work on the pudding sauces. I've invited Kevin to help with the taste testing because obviously you see we've got a lot of sauces to try out. Now,
you brought this in the other day into the office.
Right, this kind of pudding, yeah.
And I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about it, but I found myself going back for seconds.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, dang, that's good.
Yeah, in fact, and before we get to the sauces, let's taste a little bit of this without actually having sauced it up. This pudding has a texture that is just smooth.
Almost custardy.
Right, almost custardy. All boiled puddings. It seems like every boiled pudding you run into in a cookbook, it has a sauce. It says, put a sauce on this, because boiled puddings can be plain.
And if you have a chance to try this, you'll understand why.
Right.
These sauces are
They're
amazing.
spectacular. Now sometimes we got a super simple sauce here. Just butter. And many times they say, butter is the sauce for this. That's all you need, melted butter. Or more often than not, on all these, the major one is butter, sugar, and sack, or butter and sugar and wine. And basically they need a 1/3 of each one of those.
A great variation of that is butter, sugar, and brandy.
When you don't want to have too much sweetness, they'll actually balance it with a verjuice or a vinegar.
I'm eager to try that.
Right, that one is going to be interesting. And what's that one over there?
This is maple syrup and butter.
Maple syrup and butter.
Yeah.
An American variation. Real typical variation on this. Whoa. Wonderful. Without any kind of sauce, they can seem kind of dry. But with the butter, it's got a wonderful salty note in there, and it keeps them nice and moist.
Let's try the sherry.
Okay. And of course,
Oh.
it is superb. Superb.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, the brandy and the sugar add this wonderful flavor to it. This is the vinegar one.
The vinegar. That's really interesting.
I'm not sure what to think about that. It doesn't have a, I'm not a big vinegar fan, but it's not distasteful at all. Yeah.
I like it. I like it a lot. It's kind of sweet and sour and
Yeah. Maple syrup and butter.
and butter.
Yes. It does. It like turns it into a giant thick pancake.
Okay, so this is the brandy, butter, and sugar. Excuse me. How is it, John? I'm just gonna drink. I'm gonna eat the sauce. Yeah, But any one of these, even the butter by itself, was fantastic.
Yeah. Each one brings their own thing, and you could have your own special secret pudding sauce that you make with the secret ingredients. Here's an idea for the comment section. You guys can give us your ideas for what you would do with a pudding sauce. The pudding is so simple: flour, egg, milk, a little bit of salt, a little bit of ginger and Zante currants if you want them. And if you've got a great pudding sauce, you don't even need the Zante currants, and it boils up pretty fast too.
Yeah.
And the texture is really interesting, really new, kind of fun. Boiled things, you gotta try it.
Yeah.
This is too easy. It's too much fun. And these puddings are these sauces. You put them in a little saucepan, you heat them up, mix them, and you're done.
Yeah.
They're
amazing.
so much fun. So really, this one's a great one to try. It's a lot of fun. They're very tasty, perfect for a historical context or even in a modern kitchen.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Thank you, Kevin, for coming in and trying these
thank
out.
you.
And for the suggestions. I want to thank everyone out there. Wonderful comments and great questions. Thank you so much for coming along with us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Hi, I'm Jon Townsend. Today we've got some special guests. I got Lacey Villava and Renee Mahoney. Did I get it right?
Yes, we sure did.
And we're here at Gunston Hall, and they're going to show me how to make wafers. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. So, Renee, Lacey, tell me about where we're at and what you do here.
This is Gunston Hall Plantation, the home of George Mason, patriot and founding father. And I'm a volunteer here. I've been volunteering probably about 7 years, and I'm in charge of the Historic Food Waste program here with the volunteers, and love cooking on the hearth, and I'm also an archaeology volunteer.
Great. And Lacey?
And I'm our education manager here, so I work with our public programs, with our school tours. I partner with Renee to manage our hearth cooking program, and then every once in a while I get to get out here in costume and hearth cook myself.
Wonderful. So tell me a little bit about today's receipt.
Today we're making a waffle recipe from Hannah Glass, the 1805 edition. And we've adapted a little bit for our use in the kitchen, but it's an old recipe. Even though it's the 1805 edition, it's a recipe that's been used for hundreds of years.
Right.
Waffles or wafers have different kinds of irons, and this is actually wafer iron we're using today, but waffles as we know them today with the deep square grooves were also used back in the 14th, 15th century, very old.
So are they a high class thing or just common people?
Definitely, when we're talking about colonial Virginia, it would be something that only the wealthiest people would have. You know, your most common families had a pot, and they might have some plates and some spoons, but there's not a lot of implements from the kitchen, and this would have been something
Pretty
that
high
only.
end. Yeah. Okay.
Plus, the ingredients we're using are expensive.
Sure. Okay, so let's get started. What do we need to make our dough for our wafers?
Well, first of all, we need butter that's fairly soft so we can mix it with our sugar. Just work with our hands or with a wooden spoon too until you get it all incorporated.
Oh, it's pretty hard.
On a super cold day like we have today, it's hard to get it all mixed in. And then once we get the butter and the sugar mixed well together, we're going to add our flavorings.
Okay.
Today we have cinnamon, which would be an imported item. So this is one thing that makes this dish particularly expensive and something that upper classes would use.
And what have you got here?
This actually is rose water,
Okay.
which is unusual flavoring for us today, but it was a very common flavoring.
Oh, it
And
smells
you've got quite a bit here.
beautiful.
Is this
Yeah,
like
I'm going to use about 2 teaspoons probably
Okay.
for this adapted receipt.
In my experience, it tends to be something that we would see in sweeter receipts that today we would put vanilla into.
After we get that all incorporated, then we're going to add our eggs. 3
Okay.
eggs to this particular recipe. And then we go ahead and add our flour and mix that all in.
How much flour do you
This
put
is
in?
about
Just-
2.5 cups. Actually, having a cold day today is great for the wafers because we want them to be kind of firm balls when we cook them.
We're really just shooting for consistency, right?
That's true. We're just looking to get a nice firm dough that we can put in a ball. And on a day that's cold like today, we're not going to need quite as much flour as we might on a humid, hot day where the butter's really soft.
Right.
So this we should be.
Yeah, Renee and I had a really great experience making the dough back in October. We had 2 very different batches.
Yes.
One was very soft and one was very hard.
Yeah, there's no hard fast rule. It's all about consistency, how it
Okay.
feels to you that day. In a modern kitchen, you would put it in the refrigerator for about an hour just to get it nice and firm. Today, it's outside. It's very cold. We could set it aside for a little bit because you can't cook this wet dough in this particular wafer iron.
Okay, so it really needs to set.
It really needs to set up a little bit
Okay.
to harden a bit. So here's the dough we made earlier and set aside. So it'd be nice and chilled so we can make our balls of dough. And maybe I can get you to roll
Okay,
the dough
okay.
for me.
Okay,
As many as you want to get. Good size, a little bit bigger than a walnut, not quite as big as a golf ball.
okay.
Be about the right size. So here is our wafer iron that we've had heating in the hearth for about 10 minutes. For today, we're going to add shortening. In the 18th century, of course, they would have used probably lard to grease it.
Great.
So here we go. Let me move this out of the way. We press it. And with practice, you learn when it's done. It's pretty much you're listening for the sound and you're smelling it, making sure it's not getting burnt smell, and then you kind of know it's done. It's just really...
Because this is constantly getting cooler, you have to always be adjusting your system, basically.
Yes, definitely. The timing, and eventually you realize, okay, I can't get any more out of here. But those 2 are really quite beautiful and perfectly, in my opinion, cooked.
So these look perfect. They turned out
They
really
did.
well.
Yeah, they look great.
So
Takes practice.
I think we should try them out.
Yeah,
They probably would have had other things on them in the time period.
absolutely. We sprinkled the one with sugar, obviously, but they could have been filled with cream, with fruit, with a variety of other things. You can still smell the rose water in them.
Yeah, but it's not overpowering
No.
at all. Sometimes rose water, when it's in it, it can smell like soap or something. But this is just a little hint of that. Gives it a nice aroma here in the wood smoky kitchen. Wonderful flavor. I can imagine this being used in all kinds of ways.
Would have set an elegant table, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yes, beautiful and tasty. Amazing. So, I want to thank you both for
Thank you.
showing and demonstrating, giving us this receipt. It's an amazing thing. I'm hoping everyone has a waffle or a wafer iron at home so they can try this.
It's a lot of fun.
And coming here to Gunston Hall, if you get a chance, you can come here. Maybe they can watch you make wafers here. Also, tell me a little bit about the cooking programs you do here.
Right, so we have a variety of cooking programs. Renee here is a volunteer for our hearth cooking program, but we also do hearth cooking classes twice a year. So in March and October, our next ones are coming up really shortly.
Great.
And we have a small cadre of participants who get to learn what it's like to cook in an 18th century kitchen.
So that's coming up in March. How can people get a hold of you if they want to participate?
We've got a link right on our website.
Okay.
So I'm sure you'll put a link on
Right,
the
we'll put a
video.
link in the description so that you can go to their website and check that out. Thank you so much for bringing this to us and showing us how this all works out. I'm excited. I want to start making some waffle irons.
Amaze your friends.
Thank you so much for coming along with us as we're experimenting, we're trying these things out, we're smelling, we're tasting, we're savoring the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Hi, I'm Jon Townsend, and we're here today at historic Gunston Hall, home of George Mason, a forgotten founding father in American history, and we're right outside Washington, D.C. I've got with me Michael Twitty. He's a culinary historian.
How you doing?
I am doing very well, and we are going to be doing an okra soup. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. So, Michael, tell us a little bit about what you specialize in. What do you do?
So I am a food writer, I'm a culinary historian and historic interpreter, and I focus on the foodways of the enslaved from Africa to America, from slavery to freedom, from arrival to past Reconstruction.
Okay.
So that's my worldview in terms of food. And not just one particular area, the Chesapeake, the Low Country, the Lower
Right.
Mississippi Valley, the places in between, the roots in the Caribbean, in Brazil,
Right.
and historic foodways in West Central Africa, and how those foodways have a collision with European Native American foodways to create the basis of what Southern cuisine as we know it is today.
And you're working on a book?
Yes, The Cooking Gene from HarperCollins,
Okay.
which traces my own family history through food.
So when is that going to be out?
August 2017.
Sounds great. So tell us a little bit about this okra soup we're going to be doing today.
So okra is a vegetable from tropical Africa.
Okay.
It's thousands of years old, and it's pretty much found all over the continent. It's spread to southern Asia and China, and it traveled around the world partly because of the Portuguese slave trade. So okra has been around for quite a while, but for most Americans, it's a southern vegetable. It's associated with the arrival of Africans in response to the slave trade, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries. It probably started, bounced from the Caribbean, then to the South, as opposed to directly coming over from Africa. What we know about okra is that at least by 1740s, whites and blacks in Philadelphia are growing this vegetable. We don't really have a good grip on how old in the American South, because it's, the seeds don't exactly last too long in the archaeobotanical record. But pretty much we're talking about okra has been here since before the Revolution.
And would they have generally cooked it in a soup like we're doing today?
Oh, absolutely. Deep fried okra comes much later. But okra soup is one of the foods that you could have found from Senegal to Angola. That's the entire length of the West African coast during the transatlantic slave trade. So for our purposes, okra can also be found in the Chesapeake okra soup, in the Low Country, and also as gumbo in New Orleans. So all the major points of Southern food are touched upon by this one vegetable, just as okra would have been found among all the different kinds of peoples who came to the South during the time of the slave trade.
To start this recipe, we need to create a rich broth.
The broth takes a while to develop, and that's the real secret of this soup, is that it's not just throw everything in a pot and let it boil. In this case, a little bit of chicken broth, a little beef broth. But what you want to do is have that onion with the cloves in it, have, any other things you want to put. You can put herbs in that stage. In my recipe, I tend to put the herbs in the last part because they're fresh. And I want that fresh burst at the end of the dish. Some beef tallow that we had, throw that in there. Any scraps. So what we want to do is just have all of those flavors stew down. The broth itself takes about an hour or two if you really want to have the full experience.
Now that the broth is developed, we're going to continue making our soup.
So what we're doing is we're going to flour the onions and garlic. We're going to fry up, and we're going to use a little bit of modern lard, aka partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, and a little bit of butter. However, people are scared of lard, and it's unfortunate because lard is natural. Lard is no less healthy or unhealthy for you than other things, and it would have been the typical fat used to fry things at that point, especially in the South. So we're going to use that little bit of butter to bring out the flavor, help it brown, but also create a base for the okra soup. So we're going to take some small okra, smallest okras we have. You want small okra because those are the ones that are going to be not so slimy.
So like you would want a summer squash when it's young and small, you want okras when it's young and small.
Exactly. But okra needs to be cut very thin, and the smaller the okra, the better to start with. And that's how it works. And also, you think about it, people think now soup in the middle of the summer. Well, you know, a better way to stay hydrated in a time period when there was very little clean water, and the best way to have clean water was to boil it. I'm gonna go ahead and add the okra as well as the onions, and then it's gonna be followed by the tomatoes.
So tomatoes in the 18th and 19th century can be a tricky topic. Some different cultures thought of them as poisonous. What do you think?
It's because they're nightshades, and nightshades are technically poisonous plants. But you would die of overeating tomatoes before you actually die of eating tomatoes. Same thing for potatoes or peppers. But the interesting part of it is that African, Mediterranean, certainly Latin cultures at the time were all eating tomatoes frequently. In the colonial Chesapeake, we know, for example, that tomatoes were being grown like 1720s, 1730s, 1740s. You can buy them at market. People were eating tomatoes. And they certainly were widely distributed in West Africa, and certainly a part of West Central African cuisine long before the arrival of Africans in the South. So as I add the tomatoes to the pot, I'm also going to add some kosher salt, some kitchen pepper, some black pepper, and some herbs, consisting of sage, thyme, and rosemary. So just to give it a little bit more flavor, I'm adding a little bit of smoked protein, smoked meat to the pot, which is pretty typical for this dish. You can add just about anything you want, but in this case, we're adding a little bit of smoked turkey. And last but not least, I'm adding a little bit of fresh parsley. And we're gonna cook that down for about an hour, and then we're gonna have a lovely pot of okra soup served on top of cooked rice.
Wonderful.
For a lot of black interpreters, you know, they love to be, you know, part of various units representing the soldiers during the Civil War. And that is beautiful, and that's heroic, and that's wonderful. But as I often joke, a lot of people want to play glory. Nobody wants to play roots. And, you know, it's tough. But both of those stories need to be told. The stories of free people of color and stories of black Civil War soldiers and abolitionists, but also the everyday people who made up the bulk of the black population. People who had lived for generations in bondage and were hoping for their freedom. And so I see it as my own personal mission to enter their world by doing the tasks, by being an enslaved cook.
Wonderful flavors. The okra, it goes right along with it. I mean, it's not like it's got a flavor of its own, but it blends right in there with everything else.
Okra dances with other vegetables, especially tomatoes and corn and rice.
Right.
Very
so
tasty.
This has got some just amazing flavors in it.
So the kitchen pepper actually makes it, I think.
I think so. Yeah, yeah. Wow, excellent. And little bits of meat in there.
Yeah. And different colors. I mean, it's a very colorful sort of dish. It's not monochromatic.
Wow. I've been missing out on okra all this time.
Yeah, you need more okra in your life.
Thank you so much for bringing us this wonderful okra soup. The taste is wonderful. If you've missed out on okra like I have, give this a try. This one is a wonderful recipe. You really need to try it. So thank you so much for bringing this.
Thanks, sir.
And I want to thank everyone for coming along with us, trying this out along with us, savoring the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Hi, I'm Jon Townsend. I'm here today at Gunston Hall. Again, I've got Michael Twitty with me as a special guest. Today we're talking about the evolution of barbecue sauces in early America. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. So barbecue sauces, tell me a little bit about the history of barbecue, at least in this setting, and what we got here.
So barbecue is not just people roasting meat on a fire. Barbecue is a very specific American, Atlantic world, creation. It's what happens when African and Native American in particular cooking styles, grilling something over a wooden framework for a period of hours, or over a hole in the ground for a period of hours, is particularly the root of barbecue. Today what we're going to do is going to take a portion of beef rib. Normally this would be done a whole animal,
Right.
A whole hog, a whole sheep, whole cow, whatever, whole pig.
Right, and outside.
Outside in a hole over a framework of sticks.
And it's a celebratory kind of thing? It's not
Yeah,
just an everyday
this would be
thing.
something that you would have during the warmer parts of the year, or even Christmas time. And for the enslaved community in particular, this would be one of the rare opportunities where they could actually have fresh meat from a domesticated animal that would be, in mass quantity. So this would be something that would be very unique to the Southern celebratory repertoire.
This one you've already pre-prepared, right? We've already got some preparing.
So there's a little bit of cloves stuck into the fat portion of the meat, which is it's very deep, and also I scored this section of beef rib and put a little bit of garlic inside. And some people may be like, well, what's all that about? In the 18th and 19th centuries, they were still working from the sort of medieval of like spicing repertoire, much more elaborate than what you see come the early 20th century, where the cookbooks were written for people who were of limited means, who might have just been learning how to cook, learning how to read, and learning how to read English.
Right. So they stripped all that out.
Yeah, stripped all that. Very simple, sort of like basics. But in this time period, when you're reading Mary Randolph and other people, they're talking about barbecue that involves wine and mushroom sauce, and there's hot pepper. So this people in different areas did barbecue according to their own particular tastes and what they had access to. So what we're going to do is first put a little bit of mustard down, just rub it all over. And what's going to do is, as the fat renders and as the juices come out, it'll all kind of merge together. And if this looks familiar, folks who are from certain parts of the Carolinas where mustard's used, it's a very German thing in the South. We're using the use of mustard. Whereas the hot peppers is very African and Caribbean. And so because we don't have any mushroom catsup, we'll use the equivalent, which is Worcestershire, our modern equivalent. Then we'll take a little bit of salt. This is kitchen pepper. Everybody has their own kitchen pepper. Like everybody has their own curry or whatever. I just use 1 part each of allspice, ginger, cloves, black pepper, white pepper, nutmeg, and something else.
The secret ingredient.
The secret ingredients.
Okay.
From the perspective of West Africans and Western Europeans, they're both taking advantage of these spices. So they operate on a bicultural level. So you have both elements being honored in this dish. And of course we have the world favorite, red pepper. What we're going to do is, we're going to pull some coals out. We're going to put them into the gridiron, and then we're just going to let it cook for however long it takes. And then meanwhile, we'll work on the sauces.
So our meat's been on the gridiron here for a while. It's time for the sauces.
Right.
What are we gonna make?
So there's 2 sauces that I wanted to share with the audience. And one is a sauce we presume is from about 1770, 1780 in Virginia. And it's composed of butter, vinegar, sage, and red pepper. Okay. That one comes from a reference from the late 1800s. It talks about a Virginia barbecue of 100 years ago. It talks about how simple the mop was. And it's pretty consistent with what we know and heard about barbecue from its 18th century descriptions through its mid-19th century descriptions. So the simple one what we're gonna do is take some butter and put a little bit of sage into it. And then when it melts down, we're gonna add vinegar. We're gonna add the salt, the red pepper, and the black pepper. And we're gonna let that cook, and that's it.
Okay.
The second one, we're gonna take onion and garlic, saute them, and then add the rest of the spices, the vinegar, and the other ingredients. A man named Wesley Jones was interviewed by the Works Product Administration. So when he was a child through a teenager, he was learning this craft probably from his father. He became a barbecue pit master. And this was frequent. Enslaved men were, for the most part, the center of the barbecue cooking trade. He doesn't really give you a recipe. He says, this is what I did. And it's up to the cook to figure out what proportions, how much. And I don't think it's really, I think it's all based to taste. He talks about adding a little bit of salt to it. He talks about adding herbs like basil and sage to it. talks about pepper, and I'm going to tell you that, you know, for me, I like to always interpolate just a little bit. So I always add a little bit of kitchen pepper.
Kitchen pepper.
To mine. We're also going to add in a little bit of red pepper. If you'll hand me that coriander. And I think that's the most surprising ingredient in this whole mixture. So all these things that people were working with were sort of parallel ingredients to what they were already familiar with. So, you know, it's interesting to work through the food and sort of thinking about the thought process of these cooks, which are exiled from their homeland, but are also trying to acclimate themselves to the new world and also express their cultural identity.
Right. How do they bring some of those same flavors, even though they might not have exactly the same ingredients?
Exactly. So now we're going to add some apple cider vinegar, which is the heart of this particular mop.
So when he says mop, he means to put it, mopping it over the top of the...
Exactly. To keep because the meat is being cooked for several hours, low and slow, you don't want it to get dry, and you don't want it to sort of like lose its character. It's a little bit of molasses. That's pretty common. Vinegar and molasses become the main condiments of the enslaved community, and among others. All of that comes together. For me, putting these clothes on and teaching people about a time in our past when most people of African descent were enslaved is extremely important. But it also carries with it its own unique burdens on top of what it means to be a historic interpreter and educator. So how does this work? How does someone who is African American in the 21st century bring the past to life? And it's not just, we of course don't consider it just to be Black history, it's American history. So on the one level, it's part of our own unique past, and the other level, it's part of our national story.
Now we need the sauces.
Yes. Right? I'm gonna warn you,
yeah,
the vinegar is pretty heady. So it's gonna be very...
It's gonna be one of those top notes.
Yeah, it's gonna put some pep in your step. Start with 1780s.
Start with 1780s. So this is the simple vinegar sauce. That's amazing. That is really good.
Yeah.
It takes a little bit. There's a little bit there.
New things are happening.
Yeah. As you taste it, it's like more flavors keep coming through. More flavors.
And more pepper.
And more pepper keeps coming through. Really, really good.
Good.
So now I'm supposed to try this other one, huh?
Yes.
Okay. What happens 50 years later, 100
Right.
years later, this is what you're going to get. It's got some very, very good flavors right up front instead of this one, which takes a long time to get there.
Right.
An amazing contrast between those two flavors. This one's very kind of separated, just a couple notes. That one's much more complex, much more deep. I'm even wondering about what happens when they're used as a mop instead. I mean, these you just made right there.
Right.
And what happens when, they're mixing with that meat the whole time. And,
Exactly.
Right.
And that's the different experience. The vinegar dies
Right.
down, other flavors come forward.
This
And the
is
onion and garlic also, I think, which we don't think of garlic as being a American or even Southern flavoring, but it was definitely there.
Yeah.
It was there and it was important. I think that helps make it. It makes it more familiar to us because we're so much more used to it in our day than people were 50 years ago even.
Tremendous, wonderful. I want to thank you so much for bringing
Thank you.
these things to us. Experimenting with these flavors, understanding them, bringing the history of them out, that is so important. And it's like we can go back and share in some of that history. We can share in that collision of these cultures that are coming together in dishes like this. Amazing. Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank everyone out there for coming along, savoring the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Hi, I'm Jon Townsend, and we're here at historic Gunston Hall. I've got Michael Twitty, a culinary historian. What are we cooking this morning?
Akara.
Akara. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. So, Akara, what exactly is this?
It's a fritter that's
Okay.
made from black-eyed peas.
Okay.
And think of it as sort of like a West African version of falafel.
Okay.
Not quite the same, but very similar. It's eaten as a snack with hot pepper. Basically, you either boil the peas and mash them without the skin, take every bit of skin off, or you pound them dry, like we've done here, pulverize them until they were in little pieces, and then took some chopped onion and some chopped parsley and mashed that with it as well. So what I need to do now is take some of the boiling hot water and pour it on top to soften it and to let it swell a little bit up. And when this sort of batter that we have going on, settles, we'll be able to take it out by the spoonful and fry it in oil. And that will make the akara.
So it'll be a nice thick, it'll be a nice thick batter that we can work with and easily pop in the pan.
Right.
So we let this set for a while. We poured boiling water on it.
A little bit of flour to help bring it together, but ultimately this is mostly black-eyed peas and onions put together. So our job right now is kind of like turn it into a little bit of a fritter.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is going to put in some hot fat, fry it up in little drop batches, and then we'll see what it tastes like.
It's ready to go.
Being a cook, being an enslaved cook, was a tremendously important job, not just because it represented a great deal of skill and ability for the white household, but because it represented a person who was someone who transmitted knowledge between the field quarter and the big house. Important knowledge that could lead to freedom, that could lead to access to knowledge, education. All of these fruits have come out of our struggle to fully become ourselves. And I want our young people of all backgrounds to be proud of what African Americans have achieved and what all African people have achieved.
They've got a very interesting look to them, and they smell great. I guess I'm going to find out what they taste like.
Yep, try one.
Here we go. Wonderful fried flavor. Got a real interesting flavor that I'm not used to. Those black-eyed peas in a fried bean cake. Not something that I'd normally eat, but they taste really good. You know, if you're putting this in a meal with multiple dishes.
It's more like a snack.
Oh, really?
It's more like something you eat as a snack, but on Virginia plantation tables, we know this was eaten. Mary Randolph has a recipe for black-eyed pea cakes.
Okay.
So this is sort of like the root of her recipe.
Sure.
So you can imagine this going, being a food that she would eat. Probably at the time when you were dry, black-eyed peas were still in dry form, not fresh.
Right.
So those are not so much summer and early fall, but like winter and spring.
Wonderful, wonderful,
Thank you.
And very interesting, way of making it, and interesting kind of take on what's going on with peas and how you cook them and how you're going to use them in your cooking. So wonderful. Thank you so much, for bringing this recipe to us, and again, a very interesting experiment in what food was like in the 18th and 19th century, those mixes of cultures. Really interesting. So thank you, Michael, for bringing this with us to us, and thank you all out there for sharing with us, coming along with us as we experiment, as we savor the flavors of the 18th century. Hi, I'm Jon Townsend, and we're here again at historic Gunston Hall. I've got Michael Twitty here, the culinary historian.
How's everybody?
And we're going to be doing a Kush, which is a cornbread hash. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. So Kush, that sounds really interesting. I have no idea what Kush is. Give me an idea.
Okay, so the word itself comes from Islamic West Africa.
Okay.
Where the word kusha, kush is the same thing as couscous, right?
Yeah.
But it's any grain food, in small little pellets portions. And so we believe that this particular dish came from Senegambia, which is the region of Senegal, Gambia, and the hinterlands into Mali in West Africa. And it involves taking day-old cornbread, and scrambling it, frying it with onions and herbs and spices. It's kind of like an open-faced hash version of southern cornbread stuffing.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the grandmother dish of that dish. So we're going to take some onions, saute them in butter. And part of the reason why I'm taking some of the herbs and putting them in with the onion So they kind of rehydrate a little bit.
Yeah, because these are real dried.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of sage, a little bit of rosemary, a little bit of thyme in there. And I'll put a little red pepper in there. Pinch of our kitchen pepper.
So this was normally made with cornbread?
Yep, cornbread made with white cornmeal and nothing else. Maybe water and a little bit of salt.
Okay. But what we've got here is anadama bread, or what do you call it?
Anadama bread.
Anadama bread, okay. So what we've got here is a cornbread, or corn and flour mixed, and it's raised with yeast instead of that, that standard cornbread. But it's really similar to the thirded cornbread called Ryan Indian bread. So there's a bunch of these kind of similar breads that are available in the 18th and 19th century. So what are we gonna do with this one?
Just break it up, and we're gonna add some of it to the mixture of onions and herbs and spices, and scramble it in the spatter.
If you're interested in the thirded bread or the Ryan Indian bread, you can make sure to go, and I'll put a link down in the description section of this video, and you can check out that video that we've done earlier this year at Conner Prairie where we made that bread.
Now, for enslaved people, this would have been one of the simplest ways to make use of any sort of cornbread, and it made it really tasty. It's referred often to in the slave narratives, and it's probably a very old dish given the African name. If you go to Louisiana, folks in Louisiana will know the name Kush, because that's a type of cornmeal, kind of like porridge, that you eat for breakfast. It's gonna saute on the hearth, and you get to taste it in about 10 minutes.
Wonderful. Okay, Michael, I see you're adding a little chicken broth to moisten this up, and you're just gonna let it simmer?
Right, exactly.
It looks wonderful.
Thank
It
you.
smells great, just like stuffing is supposed to smell.
Awesome.
Probably even better. And let's find out what it tastes like. Perfect medley of flavors and a great texture. I love the cornbread in here. It's so good. This is what you expect to taste, and wonderful
Now
stuff.
we use butter, but technically a lot of times it would have been pork fat.
Sure.
But when I make this for big dinners and I make all kind of expensive, interesting things, this is the dish that everybody wants a recipe for. It's the cheapest to make.
Right.
Yep.
The most closely linked with.
Closely linked
enslaved
with
people.
enslaved people and kind of make-do cuisine that became soul food. And I think that speaks volumes to the heart that goes into this dish.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, I really want to thank Michael for bringing this dish. So good, so wonderful, and easy, inexpensive. Wow, really, really good. Thank you so much for bringing this one to us. And I want to thank everyone out there for coming along with us as we experiment, we try these things, we learn about history and these wonderful connections. Thank you so much for joining us while we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.
Hey Dad, look what I found.
Let's take a look. I'll bet this is the leaf from the tree they came from. Yeah.
What are they?
These are paw paws. I've got an idea for these. Let's take them to the kitchen.
So paw paws are a strange, exotic kind of fruit.
They look like a cross between a potato and an avocado.
I mean, obviously these real green ones, these aren't done, but when they start to turn yellow and maybe with little brown spots like this, like a banana starts to get overripe, that's when you know they're getting ripe.
What do they look like on the inside?
Well, on the inside, well, let's cut this one open and we'll find out. There we are. So look at that.
Wow, it's yellow.
Yeah, they're very yellow on the inside, and look at those seeds here.
They
You can
look
pick
kind of
one
like
out.
beans.
Definitely has an interesting fruity smell to it, like maybe some mango. It's what it looks like here, or apple flavor.
That's good.
Is it like a sweet fruity flavor? Let's see. Look at that texture though. It's very soft and almost like a custard on the inside. A very soft and gentle flavor, but nice and sweet. You know, they're not very rare. They actually grow in most of the eastern United States and all the way up into eastern lower Canada. But the harvest season on these is very short. They're really only ripe and ready to go for a couple of weeks, maybe only 1 week in the year. And the forest animals can smell them and they'll come and get them.
I can see why. They're delicious.
They do smell really good, and you can tell how they could probably smell them from miles away. They also don't travel well, so you will probably never find them in something like a grocery store. You might find them in a local farmer's market, or if you don't find them there, you're going to have to find them yourself in the woods.
Did people eat them in the 18th century?
Actually, they were eaten by the Native Americans and the settlers alike in the 18th century, and you do find references to them, but you don't really find them in any cookbooks. Probably because they were so, they weren't available all the time. So you never find a recipe until much later on in the 19th century. There's also references to Lewis and Clark feeding on these almost entirely at the very end of their journeys. In 1806, Lewis and Clark were coming back and all their supplies were gone. And so they had nothing but pawpaws to survive on for a short period of time. So let's pretend we're settlers and you've brought a whole bunch of pawpaws to me. In fact, you have brought a whole bunch of pawpaws to me today. And we can't eat them all right away. So what are we going to do with them?
I would find a recipe that I really liked that would preserve them.
Right, but we don't have any recipes that they had in the 18th century. So maybe
I would adapt the recipe for something similar.
And that's exactly what they would have done in the 18th century. I've got a good idea for something that would probably cook up nicely. Hand me that little cookbook over there. So this is Amelia Simmons's American Cookery Cookbook. She did this one in 1796. It's got a perfect recipe that I think will work with this. It's called a pumpkin pudding. It's really much what we would call a pumpkin pie. So we'll adapt that recipe for these pawpaws. Let's get started. So to get started, I've got a pie plate here with our pie crust in it. And I'm gonna set this aside and we'll work on the filling. And the filling I've got here is about 1 cup of the pawpaw flesh. We've got it taken out. I'm not sure if I got all the seeds, so I want you to mash that up and make sure we got all the seeds out. Good, it looks like we don't have any seeds in there, so go ahead and lift that out. I'm gonna add in, I've got 1 cup of milk. We'll add that to it. And I've got 1 egg we'll add to this. This is a pretty simple recipe. There's our egg. And now we can whisk it. Now the trick with this is to get it as smooth as we can. We don't want it to be too lumpy. And this fruit can be a little stringy, it changes its consistency. So we're really gonna have to get it mixed up well. Good, you've got that nice and smooth. We'll add 2 to 3 tablespoons of this molasses. And now we can add some spices. I've got a teaspoon of allspice and a teaspoon of ground ginger. Add those in and keep mixing. Okay, looks like you've got the consistency pretty well. It's still a little lumpy, but I don't think it's gonna make any difference in this particular recipe.
It looks really runny.
Well, it is very, very thin, but I've made this recipe before. And I thought at first, the first time I made it, that it was not going to work. But I baked it anyway, and it turned out perfect. So I'm gonna trust that this will work out just fine. So let's pour this into our pie plate. Here we go. And, okay, our pie plate is filled nicely. This looks good. It's ready to go in the oven. So we'll bake this 350 degrees for maybe 1 hour and 20 minutes. I'll put this in the oven. Before we slice this pie, we need to make sure that it's cooled completely, probably even overnight.
I'm surprised how dark it is.
It is nice and dark. It looks very rich. Part of the color is going to be from the molasses, and part of it's just what's happening with the pawpaw. Let's find out how it tastes. Well, boy, I'm really trying to find the flavor for this. It's a wonderful, flavor. It's got a little bit of pumpkin pie in it, but it's much fruitier. It has an amazing little flavor to it. Boy, this is really good.
I can taste the allspice in it.
Yeah, it's wonderfully flavored. Thanks for bringing those Paw Paws in. They turned out to be tremendous in this dish. And I want to thank you for coming along as we experiment. You never know what these things are going to turn out like. So as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. And a special thanks to Jim Hoffman for his assistance in this episode. A few weeks ago, we made a centuries-old summertime succotash recipe using fresh sweet corn and baby lima beans. If you haven't seen that episode, I encourage you to go and see that now. Today, I'm going to be making yet another traditional Native American soup that would have likewise been enjoyed by the early pioneers. The Native Americans often called this dish the Three Sisters because it contained corn, beans, and squash. Thank you for joining me today on 18th Century Cooking. As I mentioned earlier, in a previous episode, we made a summertime succotash using fresh corn and fresh beans. But for most of the year, these fresh ingredients were not available, and so they would have used dried corn and dried beans. Today, in this episode, we are going to be using dried hominy and dried beans as well. Now, we hope to have an episode in the not too distant future about making hominy. And hominy is mature corn. Usually it's dried and soaked in a caustic solution of hardwood ashes and water to remove the outer hull. The hominy that we're using today is of a very special variety. In the 18th century, corn was typically of the flint variety. And the corn that we have today is generally of the soft kind, which is a dent corn that was developed in the mid-19th century. The other varieties of flint corn that we'll have today are generally popcorn and some kinds of Indian corn that hasn't been hybridized. The flint corn we're using today is a very special kind of corn. It's a heritage corn it has its origins in corn that's over 2,000 years old. It's called Iroquois white corn, and it's available online at the Iroquois White Corn Project. In addition to this being a heritage variety of flint corn, it's already been turned into hominy for us and dried. So they've done a lot of the work already for us. It's treated just exactly the way the Native Americans in the 18th century and before that would have done it, as well as the early settlers. To make this ready for us to use, all we need to do is soak it overnight, the same way we need to do with our dried beans. You want to soak these in their water until right before you use them. Be sure not to use your bean soaking water in the cooking of this dish. So let's get started. Some of the old travel journals mention these types of soup having wild game meat in them. And actually, traditionally, you'll hear about bear meat being used in this type of dish. And bear meat's exceedingly good and tastes a lot like, say, a fine beef. Now, I don't have bear meat today to use in this recipe, so I'm going to be using a fine chuck roast that I've already cubed into 1-inch squares. Let's brown this meat in a little bit of butter along with some onions. And then I'll season it with salt and pepper and a bay leaf or two. Next, I'm going to add some stock. Now, I've got some chicken stock here. You could use just water instead, or even beef broth. To this, we'll add the corn and the beans, the first two sisters. I'm going to put the lid on this and let it simmer about 3 hours. Our soup has been simmering for 2.5, 3 hours, and now it's time to add our vegetables to it. And I've got 4 vegetables here. I've got rutabaga, I've got carrot, I've got some parsnip, and of course the third sister, which is the squash. These I'll drop in, and this will cook for another half hour or so until these are nice and tender. Well, here is our wonderful Three Sisters soup, or I might even call this a stew. It's so rich and thick, and the smell is wonderful. Let's find out what it tastes like. Now this is full of a lot of different flavors. I mean, obviously, we've got the meat and the wonderful broth flavors, but the interesting textures are what really, I think, sets this apart. And the corn is something totally different than you're probably expecting. This corn is much larger in its size than a standard piece of corn. And it's got a really, really good texture. It's not hard, but it keeps holding its texture, whereas the beans have almost broken down. They're very soft. But the corn really is still holding its own in there. So we have some really interesting texture with it. But we also have all these different flavors, you know, so you get a piece of parsnip and you're gonna get a totally different flavor. You get a piece of, you know, rutabaga, you got another flavor. You get the meat, you get the corn, you get the beans. It is really a wonderful medley of flavors. Each bite is almost just a little bit different. This is such a wonderful recipe, and I hope you get a chance to try it. I want to thank you for coming along with us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.
Today we're making what Amelia Simmons calls a light and fluffy cake. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. Today's recipe comes from Amelia Simmons' American Cookery Cookbook. It's from 1796. This wonderful cookbook has many recipes for cakes and cookies. Before we get started, let's go over the ingredients. We have 1 pound of all-purpose flour. You'll also need a ½ pound of butter and a ½ pound of sugar, 3 ounces of wine. In this case, I'm using apple juice. We'll also be using 1 ounce of orange blossom water. I also have a packet of yeast I've prepared in 6 ounces of warm water. We'll also need a few spices. I've got a teaspoon of nutmeg and a teaspoon of cinnamon. The last ingredient is 8 ounces of Zante currants. To start this off, we're going to cream our butter into our sugar. Now we're going to rub our flour into our sugar and butter. We don't want to melt our butter, so I'm just pinching this and letting go so it doesn't get too warm. Now I'm going to put in my spices and my Zante currants. And now finally we can add our liquid ingredients. We have orange flower water, apple juice, and prepared yeast. And now we can stir it up. Now, we're trying to get a very thick batter or a very soft dough. Now I'm going to set it in a warm place for 2 hours to let it rise. Now that this dough has doubled in size, we can put the little dough balls into the patty pans. Make sure that they're pre-buttered. Now that the dough balls are in the patty pans, we're going to let them rise a second time so that they double in size again. Once these have risen, we can put them in the oven at 350 degrees for 20 minutes. I've invited Dad in so we can try these out.
They look really good and they turned out light and fluffy. This was like the 3rd or 4th time that we tried these, and it took a little bit to get that yeast going. It's cold outside and the house is cold, so it took a lot of kind of warmth, and then, wow, once you got the right kind of warmth, they really took off and they got light and fluffy. Let's try them out. Well, they're nice and light and fluffy. They have a wonderful flavor. What do you taste when you bite into them, Ivy?
I taste those currants. They really bring out the sweetness.
Yeah, there's not a lot of sugar in these, so the sweetness is really mostly held up by the currants. If those weren't in there, it would be kind of bland. So if you experiment with these a little bit, if you want more of a spicy bread, like making your own raisin bread, these things turn out to be very much like raisin bread. If you double or triple the amount of cinnamon that Ivy put in the recipe, maybe double the amount of nutmeg, and you're gonna have a really wonderful cinnamon bread. Well, there you have it. It was right out of Amelia Simmons' Little American Cookery Cookbook. That book is available on our website and in our print catalog. I'll make sure to put a link to that wonderful little cookbook right there from 1796. I want to thank Ivy for picking this one out and doing it. It's wonderful. The flavors were wonderful, and it was pretty easy to do. Something that you can do with your kids. If you have kids and you want to experiment in the kitchen, great little recipe for that. So make sure to try it out if you've got kids. And I want to thank Ivy, and I want to thank you for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. We've got a fun episode today. We're going to be doing a fried beet. So this recipe comes from the 1727 cookbook by Richard Bradley that's called The Country Housewife and Ladies Director. This one will be fun. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So typically, if you would ask me, it's like, hey John, you want to have beets? I would say no way, because you know, I haven't had a lot of beets in my life, but I've never enjoyed them. But today, I'm gonna try these out. I know they've got to be special. Before we get started here, let's go over the ingredients that we will need. I've got a couple of beets here. 3 is probably plenty for you unless you're feeding an army. We've got some cream. I probably have a cup and a half of cream. Also some white wine, a couple of eggs. We've got some salt and pepper, and then the recipe also calls for cloves ground up finely. We've got approximately a cup of regular white flour, but we'll also need a flour and breadcrumb mix for later on. And we'll need a little bit of lemon for garnish. Now remember, the recipe doesn't have any measurements in here, so we're just gonna kind of guess and work our way along with this. It's pretty simple. Now the first thing we're going to want to do is to prepare our beets. And the recipe actually calls to slice the greens off the top of your beets and then to bake them. And they need to be baked long enough so that the skins can easily be removed. We don't want to bake these beets long enough that they become mushy like a baked potato. So they're just baked a little bit. In our case, we just actually blanched them, or you can just probably peel them when they're raw. You don't really need to cook them necessarily. Once the beets are prepared and you've got the skins off of them, they need to be sliced. They need to be sliced this way. The directions actually say that the finished beet should look like a flounder. It should be in the shape of a flounder. Our beets are already prepared and sliced. Now we need to work on our batter, and the batter seems pretty simple. We've got some spices here. Obviously, we've got some clove. We don't want to use all the clove unless we want that to be the main flavor here. We've got a little salt and pepper, and I'm just going to put in a sort of a half a teaspoon here. We've got 2 eggs here, and we've got cream, so I'm just going to add some cream to our eggs, and I will whip them up. Now our cream and our eggs are whisked up. We'll just pour those in. And, you know, we've got some flour here. I don't know, it's, you know, a cup and a half, 2 cups. The wine comes next, and what we're looking for is a thick batter. We'll just add enough wine till we get to the right consistency. For those of you who don't want to use wine, you could use cider or just plain water if you want to, but that wine's going to bring in some flavor. I think we're going to like that. Now that our batter is prepared, we can just batter our beets, and then we're going to dredge them through our flour and breadcrumb mixture. We want a nice thick battering on there. I want you to remember that I don't like beets at all. I'm doing this for you. So Richard Bradley talks about frying these beets in lard. But we just happen to have a pan full of bacon fat left over from the last meal we did, so we're gonna use that, and it should turn out really good. Well, they're beets. These guys look great. They fried up very easily. It smells great in here because of all that wonderful bacon fat. But let's see how they taste. This is for you, YouTube. Hey, pretty darn good for beets. I think fried up, it definitely removes a lot of the things that I dislike about beets. A very, very earthy flavor, which I find distasteful, is really kind of subdued in this. and the batter is excellent. I might add a little bit of sugar or a little bit of salt on top, but the beets themselves have some sweetness to them, so you want to counteract that a little bit with the salt. But really, hey, they turned out great. I don't think I would complain about these beets if they were set on my table. So the recipe also says that these are a typical complement to fish. So this would be a something great to put alongside with your fish. It goes along with the lemon garnish and all that. That would be really good. So there you go, a very, very interesting recipe from 1727 for fried beets. I think you're gonna like them. They're pretty simple to do, so I suggest you give them a try. I wanna thank you for coming along, but joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. I was recently reading through John Knott's 1724 cookbook called the Cooks and Confectioners Dictionary, and I ran across this really strange recipe that I'd never noticed before. It's a kind of a tart, but that's all I'm going to say for now. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. So let's get started. I've got almost all my ingredients here already laid out. First, let's talk about what we're going to make this recipe in. And this we're going to make in patty pans. These are little metal dishes, usually with a little crumpled edge like this. You can still find them today. They're almost exactly like the same little pans they had in the 18th century. Now this, I've already coated these with butter, and then I've got some little squares of puff paste already placed in them after the butter. And you can use store-bought puff paste. If you'd rather, you can make it yourself. And I have an episode that we did several years ago about how to make your own puff paste. I'll put a link down in the description below. Now for mixing the ingredients that go inside these little guys. First, I've got some candied lemon peel and some candied orange peel. About 1/4 cup of both of these. Now, you may not be able to find these all year round in your grocery store, but you'll definitely be able to find them around the holidays, say Thanksgiving and Christmas. They're usually used as an ingredient in fruitcakes. And to these candied lemon peels and orange peels, we're going to add some spices. I've got 1/4 teaspoon of ground cloves. I've got 1/2 teaspoon of ground mace. I've also got 1/2 teaspoon of ground ginger and 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and I'll add that in to our fruits here. The next ingredient to add to this is the bone marrow, and this isn't the special ingredient just yet. Now, you can go get a nice big soup bone from your butcher and have him slice it down the middle, and you can retrieve the marrow out of that soup bone. Or if you don't have access to that, you can use 1/4 cup of suet instead. Now that this is well mixed, I'll set aside this bowl and begin the next part. We're also going to need for this some sweetmeats. And sweetmeats in the 18th century are just simply dried fruits. I've got some dried apricots, dried raisins, and dried dates. And we can use these in our mixture too. Now, I guess it's time for the big reveal. What's the special ingredient in this that really sets these apart? Green beans. That's right, we're making a green bean tart. I know it sounds weird, but stick with me. I think this is gonna turn out very interesting. The green beans I've got here are French style, diagonally cut green beans. They've already been blanched. You'll need to, if you got fresh ones, you'll need to have some boiling water. Put your green beans in there for say 3 minutes or so, and then bring them back out. You can also just buy them frozen in the grocery store. They've already been pre-blanched then. And we can start to pack these into our little patty pans. And we want a little amount, maybe a tablespoon and a half in the bottom of each one of our little patty pans. Now we're gonna sprinkle a little bit of sugar on top of these. After our little sugar, then we pack in some of the sweetmeats in on top of that. We want a little layer in each one of them. Now just a little bit more sugar on top of that layer. After that layer, a little layer of the marrow mixture. Now these are called tarts for a reason, because the next ingredient is lemon juice. I've got the juice of 1 lemon here, and I'm going to divide it up between the 6 of our tarts, probably about a tablespoon in each one. And now the last thing, before we put these in the oven, is to put a top on them. And I've got some little round cut ones. You don't have to have these round, but you do have to have the little hole pre-cut in them because we're gonna need that at the end. We can get these two locked together by pushing them down a little bit so it connects with the puff paste below it. Okay, the tops are on these and these are ready to go in the oven. You'll bake these at about 350 degrees for, say, 20 to 25 minutes. While these were baking, I made a wine sauce. It's made with a half a cup of white wine, 1 egg yolk, and 2 or 3 tablespoons of butter. And this, I heated it up over a low fire. As soon as these are out of the oven, you can remove the little lids, fill them up with this wine sauce. You can place the lid back on and then let them cool completely. And here they are. They look wonderful. They smell great. The sauce really smelled good all by itself. And so these are ready to try out. So I'm gonna bust one of these guys open and take a look. And okay, there we go. Our green beans are trying to escape a little bit, but they've got a really interesting look. Let's try this out. Wow. You know, there's more green bean in here than you might think. Some really interesting flavors. And this would be actually a very expensive dish with all those sweetmeats. A wonderful finish up dessert. Not too big, nice and small. One person serving each. So beautiful little dish. I hope you give this one a chance if you got a green bean tart. Surprise for everyone when they cut it open. I want to thank you for joining me as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.